You can drive to the top of Mount Washington. Since 1849, about 150 people have died on this New Hampshire peak. A paved auto road climbs to the summit, and a cog railway hauls tourists up in cotton shirts to buy a postcard and ride back down. In April 1934, the instruments there measured a wind gust of 231 miles an hour. We tell ourselves these mountains are gentle because they're old and low. But no mountain this size on Earth is deadlier, and height is not the reason. So why do we still climb it underdressed? Start with the age. Because the age is the whole trick. These are among the oldest mountains on the planet. The rock of the Appalachians began rising something like 480 million years ago, when the land masses that would eventually become continents ground into one another and buckled the crust along what is now the eastern edge of North America. For generations, people told a simple, memorakus dramatic version of this, that the chain once stood as tall as the Himalayas, a wall of ice and stone that time sanded down to the soft green ridges we walk today. That version may be too flattering. Geologists at the University of Chicago, reconstructing the ancient crust from its chemistry, concluded the range probably never reached Himalayan scale at all, and that at their highest, these peaks more likely resembled the modern Andes, or the Alps. For our purposes, the argument barely matters. The point is not that these mountains are small, the point is that they are old. Old mountains have had time to be worn down, rounded off, and made to look finished and safe. That is the first thing the landscape lies about. Erosion took the edges. 500 million years of rain and ice and prying tree roots pulled the range apart grain by grain and carried it out to the sea, until what remained sat low and smooth, and in most places, forested right to the top. To a human eye, low and smooth reads as harmless. A summit under 6,300 feet with a road up the side does not look like a place that kills people. And if elevation were the thing that killed them here, it wouldn't. Elevation is not the mechanism. The age is the disguise. The accessibility is the bait, because the range is low and worn and close to where tens of millions of people live. We ran roads into it, and the roads changed who shows up. Mount Washington is the sharpest example on the continent. It has a paved toll road to the summit, a cog railway that has pushed passengers up the western side since the 1860s, a snack bar, a museum, and a weather station staffed every single day of the year. On a clear summer weekend, the top is crowded. By one common count, it is the 6th most visited summit in the world. People come up in sneakers and shorts, carrying a phone and half a liter of water, because everything about the approach tells them this is a scenic drive with a gift shop, not an expedition. Compare that to the mountains we actually treat with respect. Denali wears its danger out in the open, in glaciers and altitude and a permit system, and weeks of effort. Rainier makes you rope up and register your name. Those mountains filter their visitors. They frighten off the unprepared before the unprepared can get hurt. Mount Washington does the opposite. It welcomes them. It sells them a postcard at 6,188 feet and lets them believe the drive up is the entire story. The accessibility that makes it charming is exactly what makes it lethal, because it strips away the one thing that keeps people alive on serious mountains, which is the plain fear that stops you at the trailhead and makes you ask whether you brought enough. There is an older answer to that question, and it belongs to the people who knew this land first. The Abenaki, who lived in these mountains long before there was a road or a railway or a gift shop, treated the summit as the home of a powerful spirit, and by long tradition did not climb to the top. Call it belief if you like. In practice, it was a rule, passed down and obeyed, that kept human beings off the most exposed ground on the mountain during exactly the conditions that kill people. That is not superstition standing in for knowledge. That is knowledge, encoded as respect, built from generations of watching what the high peak does to anything caught on it. The road and the railway represent the opposite instinct. the belief that a place can be scheduled, ticketed, and visited on a summer afternoon, regardless of what it happens to be doing that day. The mountain does not recognize the schedule. So if it isn't the height, what is it? It is where the mountain stands and the shape of the thing. At 6,288 feet, Mount Washington is the highest point in the northeastern United States, and it sits square in the path of weather that crosses the entire continent to reach it. Storm systems travel hundreds of miles over land from the west, with nothing tall enough to break them before they arrive. More than that, several major storm tracks tend to converge over this corner of New England, funneling weather up from the Gulf, in off the Atlantic, and down out of the Northwest, so the summit collects storms from multiple directions at once, and often catches more than one at a time. When that moving air runs into the rising ground, the ridgelines force it upward and squeeze it through the gaps, and air that is shoved up and channeled has to speed up to get through. The mountain does not merely stand in the wind, it accelerates it. Then there is the tree line, and this is the detail almost nobody thinks about until it has them. On Mount Washington, the forest gives out at an unusually low elevation. The tree line here sits about as low as anywhere on Earth for its latitude, which means the shelter of the woods ends early, far sooner than your instincts expect. You climb up out of the trees while you still feel like you are barely started, and above that line there is nothing. Nothing to break the wind, nothing to duck behind, no canopy to trap a little warmth. The mountain pulls away your cover exactly where the wind is worst, and it does it early, before most people have thought to be afraid. Put those pieces together, and you have built a machine for manufacturing winter. The base of the mountain can sit at a pleasant 70 degrees, while the summit is at or below freezing on the same afternoon. Winds reach hurricane force, 74 miles an hour and up, on more than 100 days a year. That is not a storm season. That is most of the calendar. A person can leave the parking lot in shirt-sleeve warmth and walk into full winter within an hour, into wind that leans on you like a hand against your chest, and cold that finds every gap in what you happen to be wearing. Translate the numbers into a body. A steady hurricane-force wind takes away your balance, so that staying upright becomes a task in itself, and a stumble can slide you somewhere you cannot climb back from. Wind drives cold through clothing many times faster than still air. So a temperature that would be survivable in calm conditions becomes a countdown. This is why the deaths here are so rarely dramatic. Most are not falls. Most are hypothermia, the quiet kind, the body losing heat faster than it can make it until the decisions stop being good ones and then stop being decisions at all. At the wind chills this summit reaches, far below zero for much of the winter, bare skin can freeze in a matter of minutes, and a person who is wet or tired or simply dressed for the parking lot loses the fight faster still. That last part matters more than any single record. A surprising share of the people who have died up here were caught not in the depth of winter, but in the warm months, in June and July and August, dressed for the pleasant valley they had left barely an hour earlier. They did not die because they were reckless. They died because the mountain runs a different season than the one at its base, and it swaps them faster than a person on foot can retreat back down into summer. The people who know this best live on top of it. The Mount Washington Observatory has kept a crew on the summit around the clock for decades, in a building chained to the rock, precisely because the weather up there is worth watching every hour. It was that kind of crew, on the 12th of April in 1934, that recorded the gust the mountain is famous for, 231 miles an hour, the fastest wind ever measured on the surface of the earth, a record it would hold for more than 60 years. And the detail that matters is not the number. It is that human beings were out in it. To keep the instruments reading, observers had to go outside into that wind and knock the ice off the anemometer by hand, because up there the fog freezes as it touches you, building feathery rime into the wind On every rail and rope and antenna, and a coded instrument stops, telling the truth. That is the place. People go outside in it to do a job on a mountain you can also reach in a family sedan. And when the cloud is down on the summit, which is most of the time, the fog and the freezing rime together erase the world to an arm's length. There is no horizon. There is no visible slope. No way to read which direction is up the mountain and which is down. People have died within a few steps of a building they simply could not see, and that is not a failure of nerve. It is what a whiteout does to a human being, an animal that navigates almost entirely by sight and has nothing to fall back on the moment the sight is taken away. Hold on to that, because it is about to matter. That is the engine. Now put an ordinary person inside it and watch how fast the options disappear. In the fall of 1855, a 23-year-old woman named Lizzie Bourne started up the mountain in the afternoon with her uncle and her cousin. Their goal was reasonable and small: reach the summit house, the little hotel near the top, and spend the night. They had a path to follow and a clear destination in front of them. For a while, they had the day under control. The warning came the way it always comes here, as a change in the air. The wind rose, the temperature dropped, clouds settled over the upper mountain, and the light began to go. They were high on the slope by then, close to the top, and that closeness is what shaped the decision they made next. Turning around meant a long descent in failing light over ground they had just fought up. The summit was just ahead, or felt like it. Pushing on looked like the shorter road to safety, so they pushed on. The mountain took the option away. The cloud thickened until they could not see the building they were climbing toward, could not see the path under their feet, could not see much of anything at all. They stopped where they stood and did the only thing left to do. They piled loose stones into low walls to break the wind, and they waited for the night to pass. The wind did not ease. The cold did not ease. Exposure works patiently and without any drama, and it worked on Lizzie Bourne through the dark hours. She died before morning, out in the open, a short walk from a warm room she never saw. When the light came back, her uncle and cousin finally saw where they had spent the night. The summit house stood just above them, a few hundred feet away and no more. They had stopped almost on top of it. Lizzie Bourne became one of the first recorded deaths on Mount Washington, and her death wrote the template for most of the ones that followed. Not a fall. Not an animal. Not bad luck of the freak variety. Just weather that closed the distance faster than 3 people could climb the last short stretch of it, and a mountain where being close to safety is worth nothing if you cannot cross the final gap before the cold crosses it first. A stone cairn still marks the spot where they stopped. Her name became one of the first entries on a list that now runs to roughly 150, a list the mountain has kept adding to steadily ever since, in nearly every decade and in nearly every season. Surely you are thinking, we fixed this. A century and a half is a long time. We have satellite forecasts now, and radios, and aircraft, and locator beacons that can call for help from anywhere on the planet. Lizzie Bourne's whole problem was that she could not see the hotel and could not call for help, and both of those are solved problems now, so the dying should have stopped, or at least dropped to almost nothing. It did not. And the reason it did not is the hardest and the most important part of this whole story. On the 15th of February, 2015, an experienced mountaineer named Kate Matrosova set out before dawn to cross the northern peaks of the Presidential Range in a single winter day. She was strong and serious about the mountains, a finance professional in New York who had come to the sport with real drive and real skill, using ranges like this one to train for the bigger summits she meant to climb. With her sights set as high as Everest, she planned the route carefully. She carried modern winter gear, and, most important of all, she carried a personal locator beacon, a device whose entire reason to exist is to guarantee that if everything falls apart, you can still reach out and call the world for help. She knew what the day held, because the forecast was not a secret. The Mount Washington Observatory had called for gusts up to 125 miles an hour, and wind chills near 70 degrees below zero, with the night colder still. Those are not numbers that describe difficult conditions. Those are numbers that describe a mountain actively trying to kill anything exposed on it. She went anyway, in the dark, and at first she climbed well. She reached the summit of Mount Madison. She pushed on and reached the summit of Mount Adams. And somewhere past Adams, the mountain stopped letting her go forward. The wind beat her back off the high ground. She turned to descend toward a col, one of the low saddles between the peaks, and she made for the single place on that map that should have meant survival, a mountain hut kept by the Appalachian Mountain Club. It was closed, locked and shuttered for the winter, the way it always is in February, because nobody is supposed to be up there in February. There was no warm room waiting behind that door. The shelter she had been navigating toward offered her nothing but a wall to get out of the wind against, and the wind was coming from everywhere. So she did the exact thing the modern world built for this exact moment. She triggered her beacon. And here is the part people find hardest to accept. The system worked. The signal went out. It was received. Within the design of the whole apparatus, rescuers now knew that someone was in serious trouble high on the northern peaks. And they knew roughly where. The message got through cleanly, the way the brochure promises it will. The message got through to people who then had to walk into the same 70 below wind chill that was already killing her. That is the wall no piece of technology has ever climbed. New Hampshire Fish and Game and the volunteer mountain rescue teams mobilized fast, and then ran straight into physics. The beacon had fired in the afternoon, and it kept refreshing her position through the evening, so the people coordinating the response knew almost exactly where to send help. Knowing where is not the same as being able to reach it. Putting a helicopter into the air was a non-starter, because an aircraft cannot fly into 100-mile-an-hour wind and cannot see through blowing snow, so the fastest line on the map was gone before anyone reached for it. That left boots. A ground team started up that night, climbing into the forest on the lower mountain where the trees still gave them a little cover, and for a while, they made progress. Above the tree line, the same wind that was killing her turned the last stretch into a wall. Forward motion slowed to almost nothing. The cold reached into the rescuers exactly as hard as it was reaching into her, and the men leading the response had to make the call nobody wants to make, which is that sending people any higher into that, in the dark, would not produce a rescue. It would only produce more victims to recover. So they pulled back and held for first light. The beacon kept faithfully reporting her position the entire time. The weather simply would not let anyone cross the last stretch to reach it. The next morning, the wind eased just enough. A team went back up, this time able to push through to the high col, and an aircraft could finally get airborne to help work the ridge. They found her not far from where the beacon had been calling from all night, on the high saddle below the peak she had been fighting toward, frozen where the cold had finally outlasted her. She had been perhaps a few hundred vertical feet and one impossible night from the people trying to reach her. Kate Matrosova had done very nearly everything a human being can do to stay alive up there. She trained, she planned, she carried the right equipment, she called for help the instant she understood she needed it. And the mountain answered every one of those advantages with the identical reply it had given Lizzie Bourne 160 years earlier. The distress signal reached rescuers who could not physically get to her in time, because the thing that was killing her was equally capable of killing them. A beacon can summon help. It cannot shorten the distance the help has to travel, and it cannot switch off the wind along the way. That is the trap hidden inside the technology, and it is worth being blunt about because a lot of people are quietly betting their lives on the opposite being true. We have built tools that close the gap in information almost perfectly. Help now knows you are in trouble and where you are within minutes. But the gap in physics sits exactly where it has always sat. The distance is still the distance. The wind is still the wind. And there is a version of this failure that is quieter than a February traverse, and in its own way even more unsettling, because it does not require a record wind or a locked hut or a mountaineer chasing Everest. It can happen on a warm summer afternoon, on a famous marked trail, to someone doing everything slowly and carefully and right. In July of 2013, a woman named Geraldine Largay was walking the Appalachian Trail through the Maine woods. The people who loved her called her Jerry. She was patient and methodical about the hike. Her husband was leapfrogging ahead of her by car, meeting her at road crossings every few days to resupply her food, a system the two of them had run smoothly for hundreds of miles. She was on the most famous long-distance footpath in America in high summer, with a tent and food and a phone in her pack. This is close to the most controlled that backcountry travel ever gets. She stepped off the trail to go to the bathroom. That is the entire inciting event, and that is what makes it so frightening. In dense forest, a few steps off the path can be all it takes because the main stretch of the trail runs through what long-distance hikers call the Green Tunnel. Mile after mile of trees so thick and so uniform that they quietly erase your sense of direction. She turned to walk back, and the trail was not where it should have been. She adjusted and adjusted again, and every correction carried her a little further from the thin ribbon of the path instead of back onto it. Within a remarkably short distance, she was lost in a way that is almost impossible to imagine until it happens to you. A stone's throw from a trail that thousands of people walk every year, and utterly unable to find it. She did the right thing. She took out her phone and typed a message to her husband telling him she was in trouble and needed help. It did not send. She tried again. It did not send. There was no signal under that canopy, and there was not going to be one. The same deep remoteness that makes the Maine woods beautiful makes them a communications dead zone, and the phone that should have ended the whole emergency in a single text turned into a piece of dead weight in her hand. She kept trying for days. The messages sat there, undelivered, while she waited for a bar of signal that the forest was never going to give her. Then she did the next right thing. And it is important to say clearly that she did almost everything right. She made camp and she stayed put, which is precisely the advice every search professional gives, because a lost person who stays in one place is far easier to find than one who keeps wandering. She set up in a spot and waited. Later she moved once, to a more open patch of ground, hoping a signal might reach her there, or that someone searching from above might catch sight of her. And there was a search. It became one of the largest in the history of the state, with wardens and dogs and aircraft combing the woods, and at times it passed close to her. The forest hid her anyway. A dense canopy defeats aircraft looking straight down, swallows the sound of people calling, and blurs the ground into an unbroken roof of green. And she was one person underneath a roof of leaves that runs unbroken for miles in every direction. She kept a journal the whole time. From it, investigators would later learn that Jerry Largay survived at least 26 days out there, nearly a month alone, rationing what little she had, keeping notes, holding on, waiting for help that kept combing the wrong patches of trees. At some point, she wrote a note for whoever would eventually find her, asking them to call her husband and her daughter and tell them what had happened, which tells you she understood, clear-eyed, how this was most likely going to end. She died of exposure and the slow arithmetic of no food and no rescue. Her camp and her remains were not found for more than 2 years in October of 2015, on a piece of ground roughly 3,000 feet from the trail she had lost, barely more than half a mile away. When it was over, the Maine Warden Service closed the file with an investigative report more than 1,500 pages long. There is a detail in that file almost too bleak to be believed. The ground where she was lost and where she finally died sat on land the Navy had long used as a survival school, a place where service members are deliberately trained in how to stay alive when they are lost in exactly that kind of wilderness. She was found in the end by a contractor doing forestry work more than 2 years after her last undelivered text, in terrain that had been searched and researched and had simply refused to give her up. Look hard at what actually killed her, because it is not what killed the others, and that is the whole point of putting her here. There was no 200-mile wind. There was no 70 below night. There was no storm at all, not even weather worth the name. The weapon was the terrain itself, forest so dense that it first stole her sense of direction and then swallowed the signal that would have saved her in an afternoon. A situation she absolutely should have survived, with water nearby and weeks of time in hand, turned slowly and quietly fatal through nothing more than remoteness and concealment. These mountains do not always need violence to kill you. Sometimes all they need to do is hide you well enough, for long enough, from the people trying with everything they have to bring you home. And that points straight at the question this whole story has been climbing toward. If this landscape can quietly take one careful, prepared, sensible person on a calm summer day, simply by being too big and too dense and too far from a signal, then what does it do on the day it stops being quiet? What happens when the terrain stops hiding a single hiker and turns, all at once, on everyone at the same time? In late September of 2024, it answered that question in the southern Appalachians, and it delivered the answer to people who believed they had specifically chosen safety. For years, Asheville, North Carolina, and the mountain towns around it had been marketed and understood as a climate haven, inland, elevated, hundreds of miles from the coast. The kind of place you deliberately move to in order to get away from hurricanes and rising seas. That belief was about to be turned inside out by the exact geography that made the place feel protected in the first place. People had done the math that seems obvious. Hurricanes are a coastal problem. Asheville is not on the coast. It sits far inland and high in the hills, and for a lifetime that arithmetic had held true. The arithmetic was about to meet the one factor it had left out, which was the mountains themselves. Hurricane Helene came ashore on the Gulf Coast of Florida and drove north overland. By the time its center approached the southern mountains, it was weakening, the way tropical systems always do, once they lose the warm ocean that feeds them. On paper, it was a fading storm, hundreds of miles from where it had made landfall. Exactly the sort of thing an inland mountain town assumes it is safe from. But a hurricane is not just its center. It is an enormous river of tropical moisture riding through the atmosphere, and that river was aimed straight at the wall of the Appalachians. The ground was already primed to fail too. In the days before Helene even arrived, a separate weather system had soaked the whole region, filling the soil and topping off the creeks and rivers, so that when the main event came, there was nowhere left for new water to go. Then the mountains did to that wet air what mountains do. They forced it upward. When the moisture-laden air ran into the rising terrain, it had nowhere to travel but up, and rising air cools, and cooling air cannot hold on to its water. So it wrung itself out over the high country in a quantity that is hard to picture. More than 30 inches of rain fell in some places, onto ground that could not absorb another inch of it. The mountains did not passively receive the storm. They manufactured the flood out of it. The very same upward lift that builds a thunderstorm on a summer afternoon took a weakening inland hurricane and squeezed a record deluge out of the sky. 30 inches of rain is a figure that hides what it means. It is more water than some of these mountains normally see across 3 months, arriving in something like 3 days on top of a landscape that was already brimming. Every inch of it had to go somewhere. In steep country, there is only one direction for water to travel, and only one place for all of it to end up. Then the shape of the land concentrated everything the sky let go. These are steep, narrow, V-shaped valleys, and every slope inside them drains into the same creeks and rivers running along the bottom. Water that falls across an entire mountainside funnels down into a thin channel and rises inside it fast and violent, with nowhere to spread out. Saturated slopes let go as landslides, peeling away trees and soil and roads and carrying whole hillsides down into the valleys. Rivers gentle enough to fish in on an ordinary morning became forces that erased bridges, tore out highway, and cut entire towns off from the rest of the world in a matter of hours. In the mountains of North Carolina, the storm killed 107 people. 43 of those deaths were in Buncombe County alone, the county that holds Asheville, the supposed refuge. The dying did not stop when the rain did. Whole communities were sealed off at once, their roads gone, their bridges gone, their water systems and power lines torn out along with the hillsides they had been bolted to. Neighborhoods that had stood for a century were scoured down to bare rock and mud. For days, some towns could be reached only by helicopter or on foot, and the same steep, folded terrain that had concentrated the flood now slowed every truck of drinking water and every rescue crew trying to climb back in. People went a week and more without clean water. Others were counted as missing for the simple reason that no one could physically get to where they had last been, because the roads that would have carried the search were themselves at the bottom of the rivers. The remoteness that had sold the region did to 100,000 people at once what the Green Tunnel had done to one lost hiker in Maine. It cut them off from help, and it left the help that existed unable to arrive. There is the reversal that closes the whole thing shut. The mountains did not simply endure a storm that came from somewhere else. Their shape built the disaster out of it. Orographic lifts squeezed the water out of the sky. The valleys gathered that water into torrents, and the slopes collapsed under the weight of it. The exact features that made this an inland sanctuary, the elevation and the distance from the sea and the folded, dramatic terrain, were the features that took a distant, dying hurricane and amplified it into a regional catastrophe. The safe place was the amplifier, and the remoteness that people had loved, the very quality that sold the region, became the thing that trapped them inside it, with the roads gone, and the bridges gone, and the valleys full of moving water. So walk back through all of it, and the machine is finally visible, running the same way across 170 years. The geography sets the constraints, mountains old enough to be worn low and rounded and inviting, standing exactly in the path of continental weather, cut into steep valleys that gather water like funnels, with the shelter of the trees ending early and the cold arriving hard for the latitude. The weather activates those constraints, whether it comes as western wind, or tropical moisture, or a sudden February cold that no clothing quite answers. The physics supplies the killing force. Wind that is accelerated by the ridgelines, rain that condenses out of lifted air, ground that collapses when it can hold no more, exposure that can do its work in under an hour. Human motive supplies the exposure, every time. A night in a summit hotel, a training traverse before the real mountains, a summer through hike, a home in a town that felt far enough from the sea. Technology changes what is possible without laying a finger on what is physical. The forecast warns you, but it cannot move you. The beacon calls for help, but it cannot shorten the distance help has to cross. The phone is only ever as good as a signal the forest flatly refuses to hand over. And distance limits the rescue in every single case, because the thing that endangers the victim endangers the people going in after them just as much. The height was never the danger. It was the age that made the mountains look harmless, the position that set them square in the weather's way, the shape that turns falling water into a weapon, and the accessibility that keeps handing the whole loaded machine to people who read low and old as safe. Lizzie, born in 1855 in Buncombe County in 2024, died of the same mountain range. May melt meant only expressed in two different accents, which is why the last image is not a wreck and not a rescue, but something completely ordinary. On a bright afternoon, a bright painted cog railway car climbs the western flank of Mount Washington, full of people in light jackets holding up their phones for the view. Near where the trees give out, the car passes a plain wooden sign the state put there for exactly these visitors. It tells them, in flat and simple words, that the area ahead has the worst weather in America, that people have died up there even in summer, and that they should turn back now if the weather looks bad. The passengers photograph the sign as they pass it. It makes a good photograph. Above them, quietly, without any announcement, a wall of cloud is sliding across the ridge and beginning to close over the summit they are riding toward. The car keeps climbing. The trap has not changed in 170 years, and it does not need to. It just waits there in plain sight with a gift shop at the top for the next person who mistakes old and low for safe.